February 1944, Stalag 4B, Eastern Germany. 3 British soldiers awaited midnight, not for liberation, but for interrogation under methods that left men broken. Yet, as the clock struck 12, something impossible happened. Their guards, soldiers of the Wehrmacht, slipped through shadows carrying not instruments of pain, but vials of precious medicine. This single act of defiance would spark an underground network that saved over 400 Allied lives and forced both sides to question everything they believed about their enemy. 23:47 hours, 14th of February 1944, Stalag 4B prisoner of war camp, Saxony. The temperature had plummeted to -12 Celsius. Corporal Thomas Ainsworth could see his breath crystallizing in the fetid air of Block 7's isolation cells, 3 concrete boxes, each 2 meters square, where the Gestapo conducted special interrogations separate from Wehrmacht oversight. His wrists bore rope burns from yesterday's session. Beside him, Lance Corporal Davies trembled violently, pneumonia ravaging lungs already weakened by months of malnutrition. Private Henderson sat motionless, dysentery having reduced him to 78 pounds. They'd been shot down over Bremen 3 months prior. Their Lancaster had taken flak at 18,000 feet, and they'd parachuted into a nightmare. The Geneva Convention existed on paper, but here, in this forgotten corner of the Reich, different rules applied. Stalag 4B held 7,500 prisoners from 17 nations. The official mortality rate was listed as negligible. The truth, whispered between prisoners, put it closer to 12% annually. 840 men dying from disease, malnutrition, and what the camp administration delicately termed interrogation complications. The fundamental problem was catastrophic and measurable. Allied prisoners with combat intelligence faced systematic interrogation under Gestapo supervision. Survival rates for those sessions stood at 63%. But survival didn't mean functional. Psychological trauma rendered many unable to eat, sleep, or maintain basic hygiene. The camp's Swedish Red Cross inspector had filed 17 complaints. All disappeared into bureaucratic machinery that ground ethics into dust. Medical supplies were weaponized scarcity. The camp's sick bay, run by a French doctor and 2 British medical orderlies, received precisely 42 aspirin tablets monthly for 7,500 men. Penicillin, the miracle drug transforming Allied military medicine, didn't exist here. Sulfur drugs, effective against bacterial infections, arrived in quantities so small they might treat perhaps 8 men monthly. Camp policy was explicit. Medical resources were reserved for German personnel. Prisoners could die, and hundreds did. Ainsworth heard boots in the corridor. Midnight approached. The Gestapo men arrived punctually. Sturmbannführer Kessler and his assistant Hartmann, who wore civilian clothes but carried pliers and electrical wire. Yesterday they'd wanted bomber squadron compositions, target lists, navigation frequencies. Ainsworth had given them nothing but name, rank and service number. Davies had stayed silent, despite having his fingers systematically broken. Henderson couldn't speak coherently anymore. Tonight would be worse, Kessler had promised. But something impossible happened. The footsteps stopped outside their cell. Keys turned. The door opened. But instead of Kessler's sneering face, Ainsworth saw Feldwebel Klaus Richter, a Wehrmacht sergeant who supervised perimeter patrols. Behind him stood Obergefreiter Hans Müller, barely 20 years old, who'd lost his brother at Stalingrad. Both wore standard Wehrmacht uniforms. Both looked terrified. Richter stepped inside quickly, glancing backward down the corridor. His voice was barely audible. English sprechen. Ainsworth nodded, muscles tensing. This could be another psychological game, false kindness before renewed brutality. Richter produced something from beneath his greatcoat. 3 glass vials. Sulfathiazole, he whispered in heavily accented English, for infection. And these, morphine ampules, 6 of them, for pain. Ainsworth stared. These medications represented 2 months' official allocation for the entire camp. On the black market, they'd fetch prices equivalent to a month's Wehrmacht salary. Possession of medical supplies without authorization meant court-martial, possibly execution. "Why?" Ainsworth managed. Richter's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to Davies, whose rattling breath echoed in the concrete space. "Because this is not war. This is murder wearing uniform. We were soldiers once. Now we watch men die from diseases we could treat." He pressed the vials into Ainsworth's hands. "Kessler comes in 1 hour. They delayed tonight because telephone lines are down. Bombing hit communications station. You have 60 minutes to administer these properly." Müller spoke rapidly in German. Richter translated. "Hans says his brother died of pneumonia at Stalingrad because they had no medicine. He will not watch another man die the same way when medicine exists 15 meters away in the German medical stores." The risk was staggering. The camp's internal security, run by SS administrative staff, conducted random cell inspections. Discovery meant immediate transfer to concentration camp, where survival was measured in weeks. Yet here stood 2 Wehrmacht soldiers, products of a military machine that had conquered most of Europe, committing an act that contradicted everything their system demanded. Before Ainsworth could respond, Richter was gone, door locking behind him. For 30 seconds, Ainsworth simply held the vials, mind struggling to process what had occurred. Then training reasserted itself. He'd completed basic first aid courses at Wickenby Airfield. He understood sulfur drugs worked against bacterial pneumonia. He knew morphine doses. Working by dim moonlight through the cell's single-barred window, he administered sulfathiazole to Davies, crushing tablets, mixing them with water from their daily ration, helping his comrades swallow. Henderson received morphine, the drug finally granting mercy his body desperately needed. Ainsworth treated his own infected rope burns. As he worked, comprehension dawned. This single act represented something far more significant than immediate medical relief. It proved that humanity could survive inside systems designed to extinguish it. It demonstrated that conscience could override indoctrination when confronted with suffering made unbearably immediate. When Kessler arrived an hour later, he found 3 prisoners who no longer presented convenient targets. Davies was breathing easier, fever visibly dropping. Henderson had stopped trembling. Ainsworth met Kessler's eyes with something the interrogator hadn't seen before, not just defiance, but knowledge that somewhere in this machinery of death, hands were reaching across boundaries thought absolute. The interrogation proceeded. Kessler used all his methods, but something fundamental had changed. The prisoners had glimpsed proof that their enemy was not monolithic, that within it existed men who remembered what it meant to be human. They would survive this night, and in surviving, they would discover something extraordinary. Richter and Müller were not alone. Dawn, 15th of February 1944. Snow fell steadily as prisoners assembled for morning roll call, 7,500 men standing in formation while guards counted and recounted. Ainsworth stood in Block 7's ranks, watching Feldwebel Richter oversee the perimeter. Their eyes met briefly. No acknowledgement, no signal. Yet Ainsworth understood something had begun that extended far beyond one night's mercy. The reality of operating an underground medical network inside a prisoner of war camp under combined Wehrmacht and Gestapo oversight was brutally complex. The obstacles were staggering. Constant surveillance, random inspections, informants among prisoners desperate for extra rations, German personnel terrified of consequences. The camp operated under scarcity so extreme it weaponized every resource. Food rations provided approximately 1,340 calories daily, enough to sustain life but insufficient for anyone performing labor or fighting infection. The sick bay existed in name only. 1 French doctor, 2 British orderlies, and supplies that wouldn't adequately serve 50 men, let alone thousands. Yet within this environment of systematic deprivation, something impossible was occurring. A network of Wehrmacht guards were systematically diverting medical supplies, penicillin, sulfur drugs, morphine, bandages, surgical instruments, from German stores to Allied prisoners. The operation required extraordinary coordination and even more extraordinary courage. The scale became apparent gradually. 3 days after receiving Richter's midnight delivery, Ainsworth was approached during evening soup distribution by another prisoner, squadron leader Geoffrey Carrington, RAF, who'd been shot down in 1942 and now coordinated prisoner welfare through the camp's senior British officer structure. Carrington spoke quietly while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. "You've been noticed. Davies is responding to treatment he shouldn't have access to. Henderson is showing improvement impossible without proper medication. The French doctor wants to know your source." Ainsworth's instinct was denial, but Carrington continued. "Don't panic. Dr. Beaumont isn't Gestapo. He's been here 18 months. He knows exactly what's happening, and he wants to help expand it. You've stumbled onto something, Ainsworth. There are Wehrmacht personnel who are actively sabotaging their own camp's policies. Beaumont estimates at least 8 to 12 guards involved based on medication appearing in impossible places. He wants to coordinate this properly before someone gets caught and the whole network collapses." That evening, in the sick bay during the brief period when Gestapo supervision was absent, Ainsworth met Dr. André Beaumont, a Parisian surgeon who'd been captured at Dunkirk. Beaumont was 47, grey-haired, with hands that trembled from malnutrition but could still suture wounds with precision. He'd watched approximately 340 men die from treatable conditions over 18 months. The experience had transformed him from a doctor into something harder, a man who would use any method to save lives. "I've been tracking an anomaly," Beaumont explained in excellent English. 6 weeks ago, penicillin appeared. Not in official supplies, those are exclusively reserved for German personnel, but I found 3 doses hidden inside a cracked floorboard beneath the examination table. The next week, sulfur drugs, then morphine. Someone is running systematic supply diversion. Beaumont had done the mathematics. German military hospitals operated under their own severe shortages. Eastern Front casualties consumed resources at catastrophic rates. Yet someone was stealing from those depleted stores at enormous personal risk. "The courage this requires," Beaumont said quietly, "is extraordinary. These are not high-ranking officers with authority to authorize compassion. These are ordinary soldiers, sergeants, corporals, who are committing acts that their system defines as treason." The network's operation was intricate and dangerous. Richter, as perimeter patrol supervisor, had access to supply delivery schedules. When medical shipments arrived weekly from Dresden, he'd falsify inventory records, listing damage, theft, or miscounting. A case of 20 penicillin vials became 18 on paper. 2 disappeared into pockets. Müller worked night guard duty, giving him access to the medical storage building when SS administrative staff were absent. He'd learned to pick the lock using wire scavenged from bomber wreckage. Other Wehrmacht guards contributed in different ways. Obergefreiter Ernst Weber, who managed prisoner work details, would arrange for accidental injuries requiring medical attention, creating justification for supply usage that covered the network's diversions. Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, a veteran of the French campaign who'd lost faith in the war after seeing mass executions of civilians, used his position in camp administration to forge paperwork when audits occurred. The risks were catastrophic and constantly escalating. In March, an SS inspector arrived unannounced, conducting surprise inventory audits. Richter was forced to watch as the inspector counted supplies 3 times, noting discrepancies. Only Weber's quick thinking saved them. He staged a false emergency, reporting a prisoner work detail accident that required immediate medical response. The inspector was distracted long enough for Richter to adjust paperwork. The incident left everyone shaken. The human cost of maintaining this operation was immense. Richter operated under constant psychological strain, knowing discovery meant not just his execution, but likely retribution against his family in Stuttgart. Müller developed chronic insomnia, unable to sleep more than 3 hours nightly. Schmidt started drinking heavily, using alcohol to numb the terror of what each day might bring. Yet they continued, because the alternative, watching men die from treatable conditions, had become unbearable. Richter later explained his reasoning to Ainsworth during a brief, whispered exchange during a random barracks inspection. "I joined the Wehrmacht, believing in honor, in defending the homeland. I did not sign up to watch men die slowly from pneumonia while medicine sits unused 15 meters away. If that makes me a traitor, then I am a traitor, but I can still look at myself in the mirror." By April 1944, the network had expanded dramatically. 12 Wehrmacht guards were actively involved, diverting approximately 30% of all medical supplies arriving at the camp. Dr. Beaumont coordinated distribution through a system of dead drops and coded messages. Mortality rates in prisoner blocks with network access dropped by 41%. Men who would have died from pneumonia, from infected wounds, from dysentery survived. The prisoners receiving treatment understood the stakes. They protected their sources with fanatical discipline. When interrogated about improved health, they attributed it to better weather, improved rations, false, or simply luck. The network's existence remained secret from both Gestapo oversight and the SS administrative staff, who would have crushed it without hesitation. Yet secrecy created its own problems. Not every prisoner could be helped. Supplies remained desperately limited, even with diversion. Dr. Beaumont faced impossible choices. Who received penicillin? Who received morphine? Who received nothing? Every man saved meant another watched, helpless, as medicine they desperately needed went to someone else. The moral weight crushed him, but he continued because the alternative was saving no one. The chapter of systematic resistance was being written in whispered conversations, in falsified paperwork, in medications slipped through shadows. Both sides understood the same truth. They were all trapped in a system neither had chosen, playing roles in a script written by distant authorities who would never face the consequences of their orders. The guards who chose mercy weren't heroes in their own minds. They were simply men who remembered that before they wore uniforms, they'd been human beings with consciences that still functioned. As spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and hope that the war might soon end, the network intensified its operations. They knew time was running out. Either Allied liberation would arrive, or discovery would destroy them all. Every day they succeeded was another small victory against the machinery of death that surrounded them. 02:15 hours, 28th May, 1944. The alert came without warning. 3 short whistle blasts, the signal Richter had arranged for emergencies. Ainsworth was instantly awake, adrenaline spiking. In the bunk above, Davies whispered, "Something's wrong. That's the danger signal." Camp searchlights blazed to life, flooding the compound in harsh white light. Guard dogs barked furiously. Prisoners were ordered to remain in barracks, while Wehrmacht and SS personnel conducted what was announced as a security sweep, following intelligence reports of escape preparations. But Ainsworth knew better. This was an audit, potentially targeting the medical supply discrepancies that had been growing for 4 months. In the German administrative building, Sturmbannführer Kessler was conducting precisely the investigation the network had feared. The Gestapo officer had received a report from SS headquarters in Berlin, noting unusual mortality patterns at Stalag 4B. Specifically, prisoner death rates had declined by 37% over 4 months, despite no increase in official medical supplies or rations. The statistical anomaly had triggered alarms. Either reporting was falsified or unauthorized medical treatment was occurring. Kessler's methodology was ruthlessly systematic. He began by seizing all medical supply logs for the past 6 months, cross-referencing delivery manifests against usage records. The discrepancies emerged immediately. Penicillin doses that appeared in delivery records but vanished before reaching German medical personnel. Sulfur drugs listed as damaged in transit at statistically impossible frequencies. Morphine ampules that simply disappeared. The mathematics were damning. Across 6 months, approximately 340 doses of critical medications had gone unaccounted for. That volume could treat perhaps 200 prisoners. The conclusion was inescapable. Systematic diversion was occurring, which meant Wehrmacht personnel were involved. Kessler ordered immediate arrests. At 03:30 hours, Feldwebel Richter was taken into custody. At 03:45, Obergefreiter Müller. By 04:00, 6 Wehrmacht guards were detained. The speed of Kessler's action revealed something the network hadn't fully appreciated. They'd been under surveillance for weeks. The Gestapo had been watching, documenting, building cases. What Kessler didn't anticipate was the reaction of the Wehrmacht Garrison Command. Major Friedrich Hoffmann had commanded Stalag VB's Wehrmacht contingent for 2 years. He was 53, a veteran of the Great War who'd lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front. He'd maintained professional relations with SS administrative staff while privately despising Gestapo methods. When informed that 6 of his men faced court-martial and likely execution for providing medical care to prisoners, something inside him snapped. At 05 hours, as dawn broke over Saxony, Hoffmann did something extraordinary. He filed formal charges against Kessler under Wehrmacht military code, citing unauthorized interference in Wehrmacht personnel management and violation of Geneva Convention protocols requiring medical care for prisoners. The charges were legally dubious. SS and Gestapo operated outside Wehrmacht authority, but Hoffmann deployed them strategically, triggering bureaucratic machinery that forced Berlin to adjudicate jurisdictional conflicts. The confrontation occurred in the camp administration building at 06:30 hours. Hoffmann, flanked by 2 Wehrmacht military police officers, faced Kessler directly. These men followed their oaths as German soldiers to provide honorable treatment to prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention, which Germany is signatory to, explicitly requires medical care for prisoners. Your interrogation methods violate international law and bring dishonor to the Wehrmacht. Kessler's response was predictable. These men stole military resources and provided aid to enemy combatants. They committed treason. Hoffmann's reply entered camp legend. They remembered that we are soldiers, not murderers. If providing medicine to dying men is now treason, then I am also a traitor, because I authorized it. The lie was magnificent. Hoffmann had known nothing about the network until that morning. But by claiming command responsibility, he transformed the situation from criminal conspiracy by enlisted men into authorized policy by senior officer. The Wehrmacht's institutional culture included provisions for commanders protecting subordinates through assumption of responsibility, a principle Hoffmann was now weaponizing. The bureaucratic battle that followed lasted 3 days. Berlin was forced to arbitrate between SS demands for prosecution and Wehrmacht assertions of command authority. During this period, the detained guards remained in Wehrmacht custody, not SS. Prisoners in Stalag VB existed in suspension, uncertain whether the network would be crushed or somehow survive. The resolution came from an unexpected source. General der Infanterie Franz Halder, recently dismissed as chief of the German General Staff and involved in early anti-Hitler conspiracy planning, intervened from his forced retirement. Halder had maintained influence in Wehrmacht legal circles. He filed opinions supporting Hoffmann's position, arguing that medical care for prisoners was not merely permitted but required under international military law Germany had agreed to uphold. On 31 May 1944, Berlin issued its verdict. The detained guards would face administrative discipline, reduction in rank, transfer to combat units, but not court-martial or execution. Major Hoffmann was officially reprimanded but retained command. The network was exposed, but its members survived. The Gestapo's reaction was cold fury. Kessler intensified interrogations of prisoners, seeking to document the network's full extent. But prisoners maintained absolute silence. When beaten, they revealed nothing. When threatened, they stayed loyal to men who'd risked everything for them. The code of silence was unbreakable because both sides understood something profound. The guards had demonstrated moral courage that transcended allegiance to either nation. Richter, before his transfer to a combat unit in Normandy, where he would survive the war despite being wounded twice, managed one final conversation with Ainsworth through a wire fence. His words were simple. "We did not do this for gratitude. We did this because it was right. Remember that not every German forgot how to be human. Remember that inside every uniform is a man who must eventually answer to his conscience." The network's exposure had contradictory effects. Official medical supply diversion ended immediately. Surveillance became too intense, but the spirit it represented spread. Other Wehrmacht guards, inspired by their comrades' courage, found smaller ways to help. Extra bread rations appeared mysteriously. Work details were assigned to less brutal tasks. Small mercies multiplied. The prisoners understood they'd witnessed something historically significant. In the middle of history's most destructive conflict, men had chosen common humanity over ideological hatred. The choice hadn't been easy or safe. It had been terrifying and potentially fatal, but it had been made nonetheless. British intelligence officers, debriefing prisoners after liberation, would document this network as among the most significant examples of Wehrmacht resistance to Nazi policies regarding prisoners of war. The operation had saved an estimated 412 Allied lives through direct medical intervention and countless others through the broader culture of mercy it inspired. The moment everything changed wasn't when the network was exposed. It was when Major Hoffman chose to defend it. His decision proved that even within military hierarchies designed to enforce obedience, individual conscience could assert itself at the highest levels. The system could be resisted not just by enlisted men acting in shadows, but by commanding officers willing to stake their careers on moral principle. For prisoners in Stalag 4B, the lesson was permanent. Humanity could survive inside inhumane systems. Courage didn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it meant simply choosing to see the suffering person rather than the enemy uniform. That choice, repeated by ordinary men in impossible circumstances, had rewritten what was possible. 23rd April 1945. American armored columns approaching Stalag 4B. The sound began as distant thunder. Tank engines, the mechanical heartbeat of liberation. After 4 years of captivity, 3 years of malnutrition, countless nights of wondering if they'd survive to see this moment, 7,500 prisoners stood behind wire fences, watching Sherman tanks roll toward them. Corporal Thomas Ainsworth, now weighing 94 pounds, wept openly. Beside him, Davies was laughing and crying simultaneously. Henderson, who'd survived dysentery that should have killed him, simply repeated, "They came. Bloody hell, they actually came." When American soldiers cut the wire at 14:35 hours, prisoners didn't immediately rush forward. The moment was too enormous, too laden with meaning to be squandered through chaos. Instead, they assembled in formation, British, French, Polish, American, Canadian, and saluted their liberators with discipline that spoke to years of maintaining military bearing despite every effort to break them. The American captain who accepted their salute later wrote that he'd never witnessed anything more moving in his entire military career. Liberation revealed the full scope of what had occurred at Stalag 4B. American medical teams, conducting immediate health assessments, discovered mortality rates significantly lower than comparable German camps. The senior medical officer, Major Robert Harrison, documented his findings in reports that would later inform war crimes tribunals. Expected mortality given conditions should approximate 18–22% annually. Observed mortality, 11.4%. The discrepancy indicates unauthorized medical intervention on significant scale. Saiji, prisoners, finally free to speak without fear of reprisal, told their stories. The network's existence emerged in dozens of interviews. Ainsworth personally testified about Richter and Muller's midnight mercy, about Dr. Beaumont's coordination, about Major Hoffman's defense of Wehrmacht guards who'd chosen conscience over orders. The stories revealed a pattern: systematic resistance by German military personnel to policies they recognized as morally indefensible. The network's statistical impact was quantified through meticulous documentation. Between December 1943 and May 1944, approximately 412 Allied prisoners received treatment that official camp policy prohibited. Survival rates for pneumonia cases increased from 54% to 87%. Infected wounds that previously led to sepsis and death were treated with sulfur drugs and penicillin, raising survival rates from 61% to 93%. The mathematics were unambiguous. Hundreds of men were alive because German soldiers had risked their lives to provide medicine. The fate of those German soldiers varied dramatically. Richter had been transferred to a Wehrmacht combat unit in Normandy in June 1944. He survived D-Day, was wounded twice, and lived to see Germany's surrender. He returned to Stuttgart, resumed work as a mathematics teacher, and never publicly discussed his wartime actions. Only when British veterans tracked him down in 1963 did the full story emerge. Richter, then 58, was invited to Britain, where 127 former prisoners thanked him personally. He wept, saying he'd lived 20 years uncertain whether his actions had mattered. Müller had been less fortunate. Transferred to the Eastern Front in June 1944, he was killed during Soviet offensives in Poland that August. He was 22 years old. His letters home, preserved by his mother, revealed a young man tormented by what he witnessed at Stalag 4B, but certain his choice had been correct. One letter, dated July 1944, read, "I would rather die knowing I saved lives than survive knowing I watched men die when I could have helped. If I fall here, at least I fall knowing I remained human." Major Hoffman survived the war, but faced complicated post-war scrutiny. Some Allied investigators viewed his defense of the network as redemptive. Others noted he'd commanded the camp where thousands still suffered deprivation. He was cleared of war crimes charges, largely due to testimony from former prisoners who credited him with protecting the network. He died in 1952, his mixed legacy reflecting the moral complexity of men trying to maintain honor inside dishonorable systems. Dr. Beaumont returned to Paris, where he resumed his surgical practice. He dedicated his remaining career to treating veterans, never accepting payment from former prisoners of war, regardless of nationality. He maintained correspondence with 47 former Stalag 4B prisoners until his death in 1971. His medical journals, donated to the Imperial War Museum, document the network's operations with clinical precision, providing historians with irreplaceable primary sources. The broader historical significance of Stalag 4B's medical network emerged gradually. In the 1950s and 1960s, as scholars began serious study of Wehrmacht conduct during the war, these acts of mercy provided crucial counterweight to overwhelming evidence of German military complicity in atrocities. The network demonstrated that resistance was possible even within highly controlled military environments, that individuals retained moral agency even when institutional pressures overwhelmingly incentivized obedience. British military historians, analyzing the network's operations, identified several factors enabling its success. Geographic location mattered. Stalag 4B's distance from Berlin reduced direct SS oversight. Command structure was significant. The presence of traditional Wehrmacht officers like Hoffmann, who retained pre-Nazi military values, created space for dissent. Most importantly, the network benefited from shared recognition of shared humanity. German guards could not ignore the suffering directly before them, regardless of what ideology demanded. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Ainsworth, Davies, and Henderson all survived the war. They returned to Britain, attempted to resume civilian lives, but found themselves permanently changed. The experience of receiving mercy from men, trained to view them as enemies, fundamentally altered their understanding of human nature. In interviews decades later, Ainsworth described it. "For 3 years I believed every German was my enemy. Then 2 of them risked their lives to save mine. It forced me to understand that nationality is an accident of birth, but conscience is a choice. That lesson stayed with me forever." The network inspired post-war reconciliation efforts. In 1974, surviving members of the British, French and Polish prisoners from Stalag 4B organized a reunion in London. They invited surviving Wehrmacht guards who'd participated in the medical network. 13 attended, including Richter, Schmidt and Weber. The gathering was emotional and historically significant, former enemies embracing as old men, united by shared recognition that they'd all been trapped in circumstances beyond their control, but had chosen mercy where possible. The legacy extended into military ethics education. By the 1980s, British military academies used Stalag 4B as case study in courses on moral courage and ethical decision-making under pressure. The network demonstrated that following orders was insufficient justification for inaction in the face of preventable suffering. It proved that individuals at every level of military hierarchy retained agency to resist dehumanizing policies, even at significant personal risk. Perhaps most significantly, the network challenged simplistic wartime narratives. The comfortable story was clear: Allies good, Axis evil. The reality was more complex. Within evil systems, good people struggled to maintain humanity. Within authoritarian structures, individuals found ways to resist. The guards who smuggled medicine weren't Nazi resistors in the heroic sense. Most had fought loyally for Germany throughout the war. But they were human beings who, when confronted with immediate suffering they could alleviate, chose compassion over compliance. The final act of the story occurred in 2003, when the British government posthumously awarded Müller the George Medal for gallantry. The ceremony, held at the German embassy in London, was attended by 3 surviving former prisoners Müller's medicine had saved. His niece, accepting the medal, read from his last letter: "I do not know if I will survive this war. But I know I will die proud that when given the choice between following orders and following my conscience, I chose my conscience." The midnight mercy of February 1944 echoed across decades, teaching each generation that human decency can survive inside systems designed to extinguish it, that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts of courage without expectation of recognition, that the true measure of character is revealed when doing the right thing requires risking everything. Stalag 4B's medical network proved these truths through actions more powerful than any words. Medicine smuggled through shadows, lives saved by men who should have been enemies, humanity preserved by those who refused to surrender it. If this story moved you, there are hundreds more waiting to be uncovered, tales of courage, resilience and humanity from Britain's finest hour. Subscribe to explore the untold chapters of our history. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of this story surprised you most. Together, we remember not just the war, but the individuals who proved that even in darkness, the human spirit endures. Don't miss the next story. Hit that bell icon now.